We're here to increase our collective understanding of how great cities are shaped. We believe everyone has a role to play in urban design. This is a space where we can learn from international examples and discuss issues relating to built form, the distinctiveness of cities, and how we feel connected to place. We can be curious and open-minded. We can all learn and grow. So, let's get to it, Geelong.
Welcome to what is now our 10th instalment of the Designing Geelong webinar series. My name is Jonathan Daly. I'm the Manager of Urban Design and Heritage at the City of Greater Geelong and the City Design Champion. Designing Geelong is an educational webinar series to help us demystify how cities are designed, and it's brought to you by the Revitalising Central Geelong partnership between the City and the Victorian Government. The aim of the webinar series is to help the whole community to be better able to engage in the process of shaping our city. The format of this webinar, as always, we're going to have two presentations from our guest speakers, followed by Q&A. So feel free to post questions during the presentations in the Q&A function. And as always, we will focus on the questions that improve our understanding of urban design. And please don't forget that this session is being recorded. So today's topic is who gets to build inner city and why. As always, it's a big one and an important one as well. To help us learn more about urban development, we've got two very special guests. So first up, we have Tim Riley. Tim is the founder and managing director of Property Collectives. The Property Collectives building group model brings people together to build the homes and communities that they want at cost. So probably quite a different model to the one that most of us are familiar with. Since 2010, Property Collectives is established as one of the leading deliberative development groups in Australia, building 80 homes across 10 projects in places like Northcote, Thornbury, West and North Melbourne, St Kilda, Brunswick and Eltham. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Jonathan. So the topic today is who gets to build in our cities and why. Andy, Fergus, who's the other guest tonight, and myself have put together a bit of a joint presentation. So as we move through, probably be a little bit interactive, but the first section is really on who and the why. So Andy, if you want to move on. I suppose Jonathan's sort of just given us a bit of an overview of Property Collectives and who we are. And we are a bit of a different developer in that it's a citizen-led or community-led development model where we're effectively finding people that want to co-develop their future homes together. So that's given us a bit of a unique view on the market because while it's a bit of a different development model, we still are operating within obviously the wider property market and development and construction markets. So in terms of who gets to build in our cities, well, really it all boils down to who is controlling the equity, because throughout the construction market in Melbourne, the people who are controlling the equity really get to control the outcome. So, when we've thought about this topic, it's then about understanding, well, how does the equity think, and what does the equity want out of doing a development? So, in terms of defining what equity is, equity in this context, from a development perspective, is really the cash that goes into purchasing a piece of land and initiating a project opportunity. Obviously, that equity then has a vision that it wants to realise, and that equity is typically quite scarce, and its position in a project, going in right at the start, de-risk the project so that debt, which is fairly abundant, can be attracted to the project once it's de-risked. So in effect, having the equity and wanting to invest it into a property asset equals control. A few examples, I suppose, of this and why the model we use is a little bit different is this project in Northcote. So this is the second project we did in Clark Street. So it was 7 townhouses, and there's a picture on the left of most of the group of people that came together to deliver this project, and a picture on the right is that finished product. So all these members of this collective, and there were seven of us for the 7 dwellings, came together around a vision in terms of what they wanted to create in terms of the future homes. And throughout the process, they made all the decisions around the design development, choosing the builder, choosing the debt funder, and all those development related questions. The next project here is Victoria Street in Brunswick West. So this is another one of our projects. We've got 10 members of this group, and they chose to develop 10 apartments. The previous project was all townhouses, but this group preferred an apartment typology. We're about to start constructing this project. And again, this group had a vision where they wanted a communal shared space in a shared garden. And so the project has been designed around a central garden courtyard, but they also wanted to invest in really high performing dwellings. And so we've managed to achieve an 8.3 average NAFAS rating on all of these dwellings. So another example of a different group of people controlling the equity to deliver an outcome that they want to live in. And the final example here is one of our latest projects in Eltham. And that's the picture on the left is most of the current group of members of this collective. But their vision is a bit grander than the other 2 projects. They're really looking to create a co-housing community. And so we're looking at building a community of 21 homes, but critically for the co-housing vision, this group wants to invest in a shared common house for sharing meals and doing other activities, and also sharing a large proportion of the site for garden. So again, another example of people that are controlling the equity, controlling the outcome. And this slide really talks about, I suppose, this model and how it enables people to come together who share a vision around what they want to create, and then purchase a piece of land that's going to fit that vision, and then co-develop it through to completion. So it is quite a different model in that, we've spent a lot of time pulling together that group of people and providing them with a platform that they can realise their vision through. And we're effectively sort of taking a fractional property ownership at the start of the project. If you just click on the next, fractional property ownership at the start of the project, and we're turning that into direct home ownership on completion. So when Andy and I were sort of thinking about this topic and thinking about equity and how it controls built form outcomes, it all kind of comes down to then, how does that equity think? And is that equity does that equity want to do this project for love or for money? And that's obviously a bit binary, and there's going to be degrees in between that, but it's kind of a good framework for thinking through what we see in our cities, in terms of good built form outcomes, or compromised or less appealing built form outcomes. It all comes down to the motivations of the equity and what it was looking to achieve. So this sort of conceptual model is one way to sort of think about it. So, you know, on the vertical axis, we've got the motivation. You know, so is somebody investing for love and legacy? You know, or are they investing primarily for money or profit? And then on the horizontal axis, we've got time. And, you know, is that equity looking for a hard and fast return? So is it short-term focused, or is it, you know, is it a bit more patient, you know, and is it looking for a longer-term return? And I think as you sort of walk around any sort of city, you can kind of maybe get a sense in the built form outcome in terms of what that equity was after when it was initially, you know, investing in a property asset. So who gets to develop? Here we have a couple of pictures of different projects in Geelong, and you know, in the Australian market is quite unique, I think, in terms of its diversity of actors within the development space. But you can see that, you know, the picture on the left is, you know, a single home, which is obviously being built with a lot of love and a long-term aspiration at play, and is not necessarily been a financial first objective. However, you know, you can sort of see in the built form outcome, it's probably most people would say that it's a good built form outcome. This picture on the right is a small townhouse development, and you know, in that instance, most developers in that space will be smaller sort of mum and dad investors who want to do development, or builder developers, and the motivations there are probably not so much around leaving a legacy and doing something for the long term. They're probably more likely to be short-term profit maximisation, and a lot of the times that's kind of why we see the built form outcomes in smaller infill projects. These next slides are more institutional. So I think it's aged care focused built form outcomes, and obviously these institutions are thinking on a much longer term scale, and so from a built form outcome we see mostly these institutions want to develop assets which have a good longevity. And then finally, you know, we have the more institutional equity coming in to develop, you know, really commercial scale developments in the city. And these sorts of assets, then, you know, you're looking at significant 40 or 50 year life cycles, and you know, the built form is then, you know, commensurate with that sort of investment and that sort of scale. So in terms of then the local and international context, and maybe Andy, do you want to just flick ahead so we can bring up the whole slide? And Andy, feel free to chip in when we're talking about the Netherlands, but in Australia, as far as you know, I can sort of see that we actually have quite a unique and diverse range of actors that are developing. You know, obviously we have multinational developers like your Stocklands and your Mirvacs, but we also have a whole range of smaller sort of non-institutional actors operating in the development space. So it might be renovator flippers or single home builders, small scale subdivision, mum and dad developers. And then we have sort of the more professional medium scale developers, so the builder developers. And then the last one is large scale institutional developers. So it's more your REITs and that sort of actor. So it's quite a diverse spectrum of actors in Australia, which is fairly unique on an international stage. For example, in somewhere like the Netherlands, we really have no middle ground, or a very limited sort of middle ground of actor. You know, you have your large scale institutional developers that are doing large scale master planned developments. And then, you know, at the smaller end of the scale, you have your single home builders or people doing extensions and renovations. The markets in those countries have sort of matured to the point where you've sort of got this polarization of actors, and the middle is sort of squeezed out. And this slide then talks to, I suppose, again, how equity and who's controlling the equity will define what that built form outcome is. So here along the vertical axis, we have a lot of elements that go into a different development model. So firstly, it's the scale. There's the equity, you know, is it small or large? The equity capital, is that put in by a participant or is that from the developer? The risk, so who's wearing the risk? Is it a participant or is it the developer? Typically, it is the person, it is the entity that is putting in the equity that is wearing the risk. Conversely, you then have control. So who has control over that built form outcome? Does the end user have a high degree of control, or actually do they have a low degree of control? Are there any savings to market? Is the cost or the price point, you know, where does that place? Is it sort of low affordable housing, or is it sort of higher cost housing? Is the model an ownership model or a rental model? And, you know, are we looking at what typology is it really? Is that developer focused on? Is it townhouse or apartment? And then the final one is location. Is it inner city or suburban? So on the right-hand side, we've sort of mapped a couple of developers who are running alternative models in Melbourne. So Nightingale in the black and Assemble in the green. And you can kind of see that these models are effectively developer-led models where the developer is putting in the equity and is wearing the risk. And the flip side of that is that, you know, the end users have limited control over the end result. The developers relying on their reputation and the quality of their developments to attract people to it. On the left-hand side is you can sort of see how then the property collectors model, that citizen-led model works. It's the citizens that are putting in their equity. They're taking on that risk, but they're getting a high degree of control over that built form outcome. And the co-housing model through the middle, the yellow dots, that's kind of a model that we're starting to move in for particularly our last Eltham project, because we kind of see that there is a gap between those different approaches. The last couple of slides in my section is really around development economics. And it's important, I suppose, to give people just a bit of an overview of, you know, how this development economics works. So here are really just a high level overview of the different elements that run through a development feasibility that any developer is going to consider regardless of what development model they're using. So the green box is your gross return from sales or rents from the development. So that's your income. And then the purple box is taxes and charges. So that would be stamp duty, open space contribution, any sort of levies that local or state governments charge on a development. The grey box is your delivery costs. So construction, marketing, finance cost, all those other items. And then the orange box is the developer's margin for profit and risk. And that will vary depending on the developer, depending on whether they're short-term focused, long-term focused, and depending on whether they're a build to hold or a build to sell developer. The orange box at the bottom is residual land value, and really that is the amount that is left at the end of the day to pay for the land, depending on what development model and that developer is prosecuting. So there is a dynamic interplay between all of these factors, and how that interplay plays out will determine the built form outcomes in any project. And this slide just talks about profit, because I think it's the common perception is that developers make a lot of profit, and the reality is that I think developer profits quite vary depending on the different models, but it's not necessarily the case that doing a bigger development will result in a larger profit percentage. It may invariably end up being a larger profit as a sum of money, but the realities of development economics actually seem to keep those proportions fairly much in line. You're doing a larger apartment building, your delivery cost is going to be a lot more, and the vendor that you're trying to purchase that land off will have a very good understanding of what their land is worth. So there is very much a relativity across scales around profit outcomes. So just in summary, I suppose, understanding what the motivation is of the equity is really important to understand what sort of built form outcome we're likely to see. Equity is entrepreneurial and it comes in from the start. So what does it value? What's its risk appetite? What is its time horizon? Is it constrained? And typically, from a development perspective, the amount of equity that a developer needs to put into a project is around about 30 or 35% of the total development cost of the project. In terms of debt, debt is typically quite conservative, and it only comes into a project once risk is reduced. So it's fairly predictable in the way that it acts. And as a quantum, it's typically around a 60% loan to value ratio, or about 70% of the development costs. And profit, again, different developers will view what is an acceptable return in different ways. It may be a percentage return. It could be a quantum of dollars. And return could be a sort of a static project level return that's attractive, or it may be a return on equity. So again, what that equity is looking for in terms of a return will define, what the built form outcome is at the end, and what sort of trade-offs that developer will need to make during the development phase.
Okay, thank you, Tim. We're going to go straight to our next speaker, who's Andy Fergus. Andy is an urbanist with a number of concurrent roles, including head of urban design at Assemble Communities and co-director of Melbourne Architours and contributing editor at Architecture Australia. And he's also the advocacy lead at the recently reformed Urban Design Forum. Very busy guy. Andy works at the interface between architecture, urban planning and development, and has got a strong interest in the relationships between urban governance, economics and design quality. We'll hear about some of that today. And Andy's research, teaching and work is focused on alternative approaches to urban development that put people before profit. So over to Andy.
Thank you, Jonathan. Can you hear me now? Is that working? Yes, I think it is. That's a pretty good summary to add. And I think it's important to note, in light of those mixed interests, that the way in which I actually met Tim was many years ago as a more naive planner, asking, how on earth do you make these things work? And learning a lot about, these things that we see in our environment. The quality of development is not just about the planning rules we write or what we'd like to see, but has a lot more to do with the motivations behind the development. So Tim's been an important part of my learning curve in understanding this sphere of cities. So I'm going to talk a little bit first about what has just been mentioned, which is my role. So I work across a number of spheres, but principally really between government and prototypes is perhaps how I would describe it. So looking at policy, the settings we create that influence all of those development equations that Tim was talking about before, and then equally trying to enable and deliver prototypes that show us how we can do better, what the alternatives might be in our cities to the business as usual. And then completing that feedback loop for me is teaching, research and advocacy. So making sure that loop is closed between the prototypes, what we're learning and testing and experimenting, and how we then scale that up. You might deliver one prototype in 3 years, but a policy change can influence 1,000 projects a year. So I think that's an incredibly important feedback loop to me. And so I'm really interested in this question of Tim sort of set some of the basic framework. And while Tim's model is quite unique in terms of who the equity is and what the motivation is, it is a fairly typical development model. And so you can apply the lessons from Tim's model very equally across a range of development models, and equally the pressures that are felt in development. So if you're trying to influence development, what levers do you have to influence? So in my time at the City of Melbourne, I became very interested in these ideas of there are really only 3 tools that a government has to influence a development outcome. They can regulate, so they can write controls and guidelines that require certain things. They can advocate for things they don't control. So if you're a local government and you want to change a major freeway or a rail line, you don't have control over that, but you can advocate for certain things you'd like to see. Or you can invest directly, and that will vary greatly depending on the municipality and how much money they have. For example, a difference between a Brimbank or a Whittlesea and a City of Melbourne will be very different based on their rateable area. So the ability to do direct investment can be limited. And to put that in perspective, around about 85% of investment in a city in an Australian context is private, and between 15 and 20% is public. That's probably changed in recent years with a lot of major infrastructure projects, but that's been the stable rule of thumb over the last 15 to 20 years. So if you think about the role of regulation versus investment, the amount that a government can build with rates capping and these other limitations that exist on their ability to finance projects, it's very heavily geared towards the left side of the page if we want to influence the quality of outcomes. So I'm very interested in this idea that, to use the jargon, is called opportunity space, which a good friend at the City of Sydney taught me about many years ago. And I find it a really helpful way to understand the influences on this kind of design quality and the sort of motivations and expectations of the developer. So you define opportunity really around the market. Is there strong demand or weak demand? Is it very competitive or is it not competitive? Is the site constrained or is it very easy? And is the regulation strict or is it weak? Now, the aim of this game is for these 2 things to be in a positive tension. So you want sufficient viability for the developer to build the project, but you want sufficient breathing space for the designer to deliver a high quality design outcome. So to step through that, we can see how if the market is very strong, but the site is unconstrained and the regulation is poor, which is quite often the case in Victoria, then the developer's opportunity space grows dramatically. The designer's space becomes very small. So the developer might have more profit, more opportunity to push for a bigger building or whatever that might be, relative to the land value that they've paid, but the designer's opportunity diminishes with that increase. If, however, the site is very constrained and the regulation is very constrained, but the market is weak, then the developer's opportunity space dramatically shrinks and the designers might grow. Now you might think, oh, that sounds good. It's actually not, because there's a point at which the developer's opportunity space is so small that there is no project, there is no design. So I'm really interested about how you dial the tension between these elements to achieve this optimal balance between a viable development and, you know, sustainable, high quality, community oriented projects. Hopefully this diagram is a kind of nice simplification of some of those factors. To put that kind of bluntly in the Melbourne context, if you look on the left in 1999, the Hero building, now heritage listed building by Nonda Katsalidis. This is a building that was built in a weak market where competition was very high. So you had to build something very, very good. The site was incredibly constrained, but the regulations allowed innovation at that point in time to do this building. So out of that circumstance, you see a good development outcome, you see a really great design outcome. On the right, you see an environment where the market is incredibly flush with investment. There's a huge amount of demand. The site is not very constrained and the regulation is incredibly weak. And in that environment, the development outcome is significantly poorer because you don't have this positive tension between the two things. So in this instance, the designer's opportunity space was really the choice of facade material, and perhaps some of the floor plans were able to be tweaked, but otherwise the building was going to be what it wanted to be to sort of maximize its site opportunity. So I'm really interested in the interplay between these different levers we have, whether that's government, whether that's as private individuals, whether that's as collective advocates. And on the left, it's sort of this idea, if you imagine, you know, investment coming into our cities as a kind of sandbag, you know, if you don't regulate it effectively, it can crush your city very quickly and cause a lot of damage. And so it's up to government and the community to set our expectations of what we want that money to do, the physical form it shapes and how that integrates with and adds and contributes to our city in a positive way. So how you manage that investment. Now on the right, the opposite is how do you enable those who want to build with love in their heart, as Tim has sort of mentioned. So how do you enable these prototypes that we need to demonstrate how things are done better? So you can't use one or the other. You need to both enable people who are entrepreneurial and give them the preconditions to do that and help de-risk it for them, just as you need to manage unscrupulous investment that can be damaging in your city if it's not regulated. So I'm going to talk through some case studies of either of these just to show a kind of toolkit of tactics that I use in my practice, but also are used internationally in various ways. So if we start with heritage, which I know is a very popular topic no matter where you go, heritage essentially within Tim's framework is a penalty on a private developer. If you own a heritage building as an asset that's valued by the public, your development opportunity is diminished by having that asset on your property. Now that sounds quite brutal, but that's how the economics plays out. If you don't reconcile that tension and you maintain the opportunity for development alongside the heritage, you get outcomes like these. And the middle one's quite extreme, but the right one is very common, particularly in Melbourne and Brisbane, not so much in Sydney and Perth, where they have different types of rules. And on the left, however, you can see an older Perth development, which is actually not a public art piece, but a heritage statement. And you see this kind of inability to reconcile the tension means you have the big development and you have the heritage building, and you really end up with what I would describe as a stage set for your heritage building. Now, different countries deal with that in different ways and have done so since the 1950s. The New York model, which is used in a lot of places around the world, and Sydney uses a kind of variation of this, says that if you've got your heritage asset on the right there, it has a theoretical amount of development, which is the sort of amount that they're not allowed to build because of their penalty of the heritage status. And that amount of floor space can then be sold to another property in the area. So you protect the heritage church or whatever it might be, and then you allow that to be transferred to the higher building nearby, and you plan for that. So you work out where you want the receiving property to be so that they don't cause damage as well, just as you manage to preserve that heritage building. Now, the sale of that theoretical floor space generates a significant revenue for the heritage building, which can fund both its retrofit and refurbishment, but also a small gain for that property developer. So in this instance, you can see how that transferring of development rights addresses this tension much more in a more sophisticated way by trading off between what the developer expects on the heritage building and what might be expected on a nearby development site. The other way of thinking about that is what Vienna does, and I'm going to explain this through a few steps, but these drawings are of what was happening in the Melbourne CBD, where you would have a kind of building height control, and whatever the heritage building was, you just top up the rest, like kind of filling up a bucket of water beyond what's already sitting in the bottom of it. And so this would allow, you know, essentially a fairly substantial building above a heritage building. But we know what that means in reality. It means that you can no longer keep any of the fabric within the old heritage building because you need to bring down lift cores and structures, you need to put basements in. So again, this is a situation where you get facadism, or a kind of situation where there's nothing but the veneer of the exterior remaining. Now what Vienna did, which is really fascinating, is they said within their UNESCO listed area, which is the central historic area of Vienna, from the height of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, they said, well, we're not going to allow this, but we're going to exempt certain things. So rather than saying, we'll allow you to propose a big development, we're going to exempt if you build something that's quite discreet, not higher than a few levels, set back roughly at a 45-degree plane with some exceptions. We're going to use that investment on heritage buildings to fund the facade upkeeps, to fund the improvements to the heritage buildings, which ensures that they present well in the city, but also to increase density. So you were not allowed to build a penthouse if you owned the top floor. You had to add to the number of units in the building. So that was a very intentional strategy. Say, well, we'll let you have this, we'll increase your development potential, but we'll equally take something for the city, which is the benefit of the heritage refurbishment, the benefit of the density, and there were some other agreements around the way they manage the housing within that. So because when you redevelop the building, you get higher rents within the building that would be allowed, you're required as part of that to then provide housing back into the social housing fund for the city. So they've carefully tuned the development feasibility to understand that the benefit is worth it for the penalty. I think it's a really sophisticated way to think about it. What has transpired since the Bauordnung was put in place in 1996 is that of 35,000 buildings in the UNESCO ring of Vienna, 50% of them have built a rooftop addition. This is not a prototype built on one corner and never again. It is remarkable to walk around Vienna and see the degree to which this has happened. And by extension, it contributed significantly to the density and upkeep of the heritage fabric within the city. Now, this was quite challenging to UNESCO because these are very assertive and I think quite spectacular pieces of architecture. But they were able to see that the benefit of having this contemporary architecture and the benefits that came from the investment stream that it enabled created benefits from heritage. So this is a really interesting way of kind of aligning incentives both for government and a private investor in order to get a really good outcome. And just to sort of show you some more examples, I wanted to really drill home this idea that what the difference of this to the facadism you see on the right here is that because they are very modest, lightweight buildings, they can literally be built out of timber and steel and erected on top of the building. So these buildings can maintain operational. They can also, not have to destroy all the building fabric. So there's a way of building into that roof that can really allow a sensitive adaptation that seems modest, but 50% of 35,000 is not something to laugh at when you think about densifying a city like Vienna. So I wanted to show that one as a really interesting example of those alignments of incentives. But then I wanted to show another example of this, which sort of touches on the New York example a little bit, but is something that we have had a history of in Australian cities as well. So when you're thinking about the regulation of design quality, and if you're struggling with poor outcomes, there are very clear regulatory things you can do to lift the minimum design quality. So to get from a poor outcome to minimum standards, you can write planning controls and use building controls to ensure that certain materials are used, that the quality of the spaces are functional, that you have windows with natural light, all these sorts of things. But to get from that base minimum quality to excellence is a very different thing. You can't regulate it by minimum standards, but you can create processes that enable it to occur. And this is what I find fascinating, that to get from design quality to design excellence, you are required to use a different suite of tools to work with developers, not just sort of, hitting them with the mallet of regulation, perhaps. So one quite visible example of that is the use of density bonuses. And density bonuses are a really sophisticated tool that have been, again, used since the 50s. Melbourne had them from the 1950s onwards, Sydney from the early 1970s. But essentially what you can see here are two colours. There's the blue, which is the starting density that you're allowed to build in your city, and the yellow, which is the bonus density that might be traded off for certain outcomes. So in the Singapore case, the green areas that you can see are essentially sky gardens, as well as communal facilities and other things that are provided. And as a result of that, they get those extra 5 levels at the top of the yellow, which is bonus. So that means more development outcome to offset the penalty of the thing that's been provided in the bonus. And if you see in the Sydney case, the extreme example where your base density is 6 times the plot area. So if you've got 1,000 square metre plot, you get 6,000 square metres of development. But in the Sydney CBD, if you run a design competition, if you buy heritage floor space from someone else, if you provide certain facilities in that building, such as accommodation, if you provide community facilities or art facilities, you can build all the way up to 15.4 times the plot area. So you can more than double your development potential by having all these benefits. So instead of a development just sort of being dense and, that's great, they've made some money and the city gets some more rates or something like that, what this does is it really says, well, any additional density that you get, you are trading off that additional value, that additional theoretical profit against the benefits in the city. So if you think about Tim's diagram, this is essentially playing with, kind of meddling with the residual land value by saying, well, for these benefits that cost you more, the land value will diminish in order to allow that outcome to be achieved. So you might be increasing the construction costs, you might be managing the profit, so that downward pressure on the residual land value, or that piece down the bottom, is what's enabling this outcome to occur. And cities all over the world do this for very different reasons. So this is a list that Helen Day and Leanne Hoddle prepared, which I like to borrow, and it shows you that in New York, if you provide a long-term lease, low cost for fresh food in an area that has too much takeaway and they need more fresh food to support the community, you'll get a bonus amount of floor space for that. Equally in Sydney, I mentioned the heritage. In Perth, you get public toilets if you provide them on your site rather than in a public park. You'll get a small bonus for that. And in Singapore, you can see Lush, which is the landscape provision in tall buildings, which allows a benefit. So it's a really kind of a wish list for addressing market failure, i.e. the inability for private developers to profitably deliver these outcomes. The bonus system controls the equity by creating an incentive for the equity to do more for the public in return for increasing the development potential. So it's a way of controlling really that outcome. So I wanted to use an example in Melbourne, and this is an old photocopy because it is actually from 1986, but the City of Melbourne undertook a very sophisticated planning control, one of my favourites ever in Victoria, where they master planned what was called the Commonwealth Block, so between Spring, Exhibition, Lonsdale and Little Lonsdale. And they created a system of bonuses that were controlled within this lot. So they said the black boxes are heritage assets and they're valuable buildings that we want to keep. The grey areas around the outside are where we want the new street walls, and then these dotted lines through are where we want laneways and pedestrian connections. So developer, we're asking you to do all this stuff for us that will be a penalty for you, but in return, we're going to give you a benefit. So these black boxes, let's say they're 400 square metres of heritage pub. Now, if you retain that in the development, you would be given 3 times that amount of space in your tower. So 400 square metres of heritage pub becomes 1,200 square metres of office floor plate on level 35, which is worth a lot more money. So the incentive and the stick, the carrot and the stick, are neatly tuned here to create a clear value transfer between the public benefit sought, in this case, permeability and heritage, and the private benefit of additional building density on the site. And that outcome produced these buildings, which are not facades. They are fully 3-dimensional buildings with 4 sides and fully contributing pieces of city, not a stucco sort of stage set. So it allowed them, it also allowed the laneway you can see there through on the left, as well as an arcade, and also retained one of Melbourne's oldest, if not oldest, house in the CBD as part of the development. So you've got a 35-storey, high quality, fairly sustainable office block, cheek by jowl with these spectacular little outcomes on the ground floor, which are providing a great little gin bar and conference facilities and other sorts of things. So hopefully you can sort of see that trade-off that's occurring with these types of density controls, that rather than regulating as a penalty, you're actually providing an incentive alongside the regulation to ensure that that value sharing is really carefully managed. So that's one half of the side. If we imagine that kind of filter with the money coming into it, that's how you regulate and manage development to ensure outcomes that might be intentional. And equally, you know, if Tim's building at Eltham, and I said to Tim, if you provide a common facility of 100 square metres, I'll give you 200 square metres of additional residential density, that is absolutely worthwhile for Tim. It both supports him in the innovation, it allows him to provide the common facility without a penalty, and it ensures a public outcome in terms of urban resilience and social sustainability outcomes. So you can see here how these incentives can both help innovators, but also help bring the traditional development market along for the ride to build these things in cities. On the flip side though, let's look a little bit about how to enable these types of developers. And I did see a question pop up before, which this might touch on a little bit. So one of my favourite current Australian initiatives is out of Canberra, which is called the ACT Demonstration Housing Project, which always sounds to me grammatically weird and back to front, but that's what it's called. But anyway, this project basically set out to say we've got a real problem in the ACT. We've got a problem that we're not getting housing diversity, or we're building a 3-bedroom homes or 1-bedroom apartments. We're getting nothing in between. We're either getting kind of sprawl or tall. We aren't getting housing for an ageing population. We've got a really ageing population. We need to think about that. And so they've really looked to address this thing that many states have been addressing of the missing middle through a really different avenue. So rather than building a one-off themselves at huge expense to government, or running competitions that may not necessarily end up in anything, what they've actually done is invited people with a project or projects without a site and market match them with a site and with an opportunity to run a process that enables them to enable the innovation. So rather than government using regulation or using other sort of tools like investment, they're actually helping by forming a kind of public-private partnership with these developers to help them through the process. And what this does is it doesn't pollute the planning system by creating precedent. It's a site-specific sandbox or kind of bubble-wrapped room that allows innovation to occur, which is resulting in some really innovative outcomes. And while this is not one of them, this is a kind of a bit of a flavour of what the sort of outcomes might be: low-rise, super sustainable townhouses. Now, because I'm going to wind up a little bit here, I'm going to finish just on the last case study and skip the previous one. But I wanted to show, that's a very small case study of how to enable innovation through government. Here is a very large case study. So this is one of my favourite precincts in the world. This is in Buxlotterham in Amsterdam, so immediately to the north, not the pretty canal belt, but the industrial area that was full of money laundering and brothels and various other things until relatively recently. And what the city has done is, rather than just putting it out to tender to the biggest developer, they've said, well, what happens if we take the benefits of lots of small equity? So how do we enable lots and lots and lots of small developers in order to create innovation and grain and diversity and to achieve different motivations? And so they started with some experiments where they leased public land out for innovators for 10 years to, in this instance, put houseboats on the site and run creative offices that are zero waste and generate their own food and all these sorts of things. And they use these to kind of experiment with what they could start to do within this environment. Once they started to learn just how successful this was, to the point where the north has become incredibly attractive in Amsterdam as a place to live, they started to apply this thinking to housing. They started to sell individual lots to prospective home builders with very high environmental requirements, so that they would target that to what they wanted, and started to kind of curate the outcomes. So you see this outcome where people are building together. In this instance, my photo of this fella is out there kind of literally on the tools building his house. And it's producing these extraordinary outcomes. This is one of my favourite streets in the world, where everyone is built together. They've decided not to put the fences up. And this has been enabled by government using both regulatory instruments and incentives, as well as the use of their own land, so government land in this instance, to achieve these outcomes that are innovating in environmental design, as well as providing really fantastic social outcomes. So hopefully this shows at a really large scale how you can start to leverage these small innovators in the way that, say, Tim's working, and think about that across an entire city district to deliver these types of environments where people really are able to thrive. I will wrap up there.
Thank you, Andy. I'm not sure about everyone else, but I could have listened to that for another 30 minutes at least. Sorry to cut it short, but we've got a little bit of time for questions. I've definitely got a few questions for you guys, but I'm hoping I want to give all the time to our audience. So I'm going to start with one. Got a question from Tim. I think it's for Tim. Have there been any examples where you've worked with local government or state government to develop in the way that you do with private individuals?
Look, no, unfortunately. I mean, I do think there's quite a lot of opportunity in that space, because the development model being a build to hold model means that your collective approach, the group can actually afford to pay a premium for the land, you know, because they're not having to pay sales and marketing costs to a real estate agent and remit GST because it's on the income account and all those sorts of things. So the groups are actually very competitive when it comes to land acquisition. So I think it would be great to sort of explore that space, you know, into the future, if the opportunities come up, particularly if councils are looking at sort of master plan opportunities and divestments sort of within that. We did participate in a process with Banyule City Council, where we actually got shortlisted to purchase a piece of land from Banyule, who were divesting a large site. We ended up teaming up with Stockland actually on that, because that was council's preference was to divest to one entity, but unfortunately we weren't successful. We weren't the successful bidder, you know, under that bid. So you know, hopefully that can start to get a bit of traction over the coming years. Yeah,
I would add to that, Tim, that there was some really good lessons which we then presented to the state government in New South Wales out of that project. In that the tender criteria from local government was written for every other developer. And so, for example, social innovation did not have a performance test under it. So in terms of the requirements that would support a community outcome like this, the tender was incredibly poorly drafted to enable these outcomes. So in that instance, the expedience of the sale from council actually limited an outcome that would have resulted in a financially equivalent and much better social and environmental outcome. So that's just one example. I've been part of 3 processes where the same thing has occurred. So you've had this situation where the tender has been written to assume the lowest common denominator, and the innovator trying to compete on a slightly different terms has been disadvantaged because they're seen as unfamiliar. So I think there's very clear ways, Tim, that we would you could address that without any loss to government. So it's absolutely possible.
Andy, I've got a question for you. You spoke about enabling industry uptake in high quality, medium density housing. Where do you currently see the barriers and challenges?
I see the barriers and challenges at the moment in medium density housing that we don't seem to have a clear strategy of what we are trying to do. We tend to zone areas based on their existing conditions. We talk about the housing that we want, but we don't accurately target what we want. So in the outer suburbs, we need smaller homes for greater diversity. In the inner suburbs, we need bigger homes for greater diversity in certain areas. but the types of tools that we have aren't able to deliver that. So for me, I think we need to be more precise about how we design our tools that support these types of outcomes. I would say the other thing that we need to do is have more active kind of facilitation and advocacy around our prototypes. Something I find really incredible about Australia is that, you know, when I show images of Amsterdam streets or Copenhagen, everyone switches off and goes, oh, whatever, that's not going to be in Geelong. And that's fair enough. But I think you can find a good case study of just about anything somewhere in Australia. I was in Belmont last Sunday, and one of my favourite medium density housing projects is just up the hill in Belmont, an incredible 1970s block littered with eucalypts. It's got a tree cover of 5 times the properties next door to it. You can find lots of examples. Do you know the one I'm talking about, Jonathan, by any chance? Yeah, it's pretty good. It's better block and green timber. But, you know, I think we can find these really fantastic examples, but we need to be able to demonstrate them to people to de-risk it. The problem we have essentially is the off-the-plan purchase. Right now, if I'm going to buy off the plan and take a risk on something I can't see and smell and touch, I'm going to choose the thing I've seen before. So if I want to get beyond that, how can I build demonstration projects to enable people to actually experience these things to see their value? I think that's a bigger issue than ever in the growth areas, but it's equally a problem in the inner suburbs. So Tim's model addresses that by empowering people to participate in the decision making, but they are still taking a risk. And really the only way Tim can de-risk that is by taking them to previous projects and building confidence. Just as you would if you were building your own house, Jonathan, you'd go and visit the builder's 5 other projects to make sure that they're not falling apart. So I think we need to be really targeted, and that doesn't necessarily cost money, that we use the prototypes we've got and advocate for them more effectively and tailor the legislation to target the type of housing we want.
I've got one more question, and it's from the audience, and I'm going to try and connect it to the discussion on density, because it's a question about how do we apply this discussion to in Geelong. We've got very different contexts. We've got, you know, the urban area, we've got growth areas, and then we've got the Bellarine in that coastal context. So it's really about the Bellarine, the coastal context, with the distinctive area landscape been designated as a distinctive area landscape. A lot of the new development is going to be infill in the towns like Ocean Grove and so on. How do we deliver good outcomes in that kind of context?
Who wants to answer that?
I think it's a you question mostly.
So I think infill is incredibly exciting, because if you think about your opportunity diagram, the sites are more constrained. You've got generally pretty strict regulation in those areas as opposed to a transformation or a growth area. And you've got an existing character to leverage off in an existing community. So there's a richer ability to respond. The thing that I see that's really critical with infill development is that we deliver it in such a way that each infill development that is built is not taking from its context and diminishing it, but adding something to that context. And whether that's through canopy cover, environmental design, adding shops at the ground floor that contribute to economic activity, we need to make sure that it's not just density for density's sakes. You know, any accountant can put that in their ledger. My question is, how does the accountant value that place and its performance? But I think the thing that's really exciting about it in a town context too is that we know what happens to towns like your Ocean Groves and others if we build sprawl on the edge of the town. I mean, we've seen with Torquay, adjacent municipality, but all the housing being built in the growth area is generating a lot of cars into the centre of Torquay. And so there's more and more need for parking, more and more need for people to drive through that area. That diminishes the pedestrian realm. If we can have more housing in the town centres that allows people to use their cars less often, if they get in their car 3 times a week, fantastic. If they get in their car 7 times a week, fantastic. A growth area, they're getting in their car, there's three vehicle movements on average per house per day. So you think about what that does to a neighbourhood design. So I think that's incredibly exciting for me. I would say one other factor that probably crosses over to your territory, Tim, is very specific, which is construction methodology. When you build a concrete frame building, it has a minimum cost. You have to spend a certain amount of money. You probably need to build 4 or more stories, probably higher, to justify the expense of the basement and the concrete construction. Now, if you flip that and say, we're going to build a 3-story building in Barwon Heads or Ocean Grove or wherever that's going to be, or Drysdale, Clifton Springs, etc., and you can build that out of timber well, it's a lot more environmentally friendly in terms of carbon in the building, but also you've got far more builders and local builders who can build that. So you've got that ability to have a more modest, low cost, low impact construction distributed across many allotments. So I think that's incredibly exciting to think about the possibilities. The question I then ask is, on what terms? You know, what is the benefit for the place, and how do we communicate that as a community as much as a government?
Fantastic. Our time is up, so we're going to have to wrap it up and leave it there. Tim and Andy, thank you very much for wonderful discussion. Like all of these sessions that we have, they could go on much, much longer. Thanks everyone for joining in. Sorry if we didn't get to your question today, but we hope you will join us again for our next webinar. It's another, I think, really interesting topic, and follows on nicely from this one, why urban design is good for business. So take care, everyone. We look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks.